people are working around the clock on this. They're devoting every working hour to coronavirus. So you have researchers out there who normally have 2-3 projects on the go at once. They're on hold now, and they're focusing solely on coronavirus. And that's across every single team in the UK.
We are in this kind of situation where there are just so many unknowns, and it's quite fearful in many ways.
Yeah, it is a desperate situation, and research on these types of areas vary from place to place. You have to really look at the papers and look at who did they test it on, what viruses were they looking at, what were they measuring, and what were the outcomes. Now, between papers, these things differ. So we have to be careful with the headlines that we actually believe and that we read, because a headline might say salt gargling helps with coronavirus or kills coronavirus, where in fact the paper might actually say it kills a particular type of bacteria. We have to make sure that what the headlines are saying actually reflect the content within that paper. These are really important things. And I understand for everyone who's out there, there's so much information every single day. Where do they look? What do they believe? And obviously, if you're not from a scientific background, how do you kind of understand this information and put it together? I have to say, you really start to learn how to be a doctor when you start being a doctor. When I was a third year medical student, I was able to do things by a textbook. So you're given a patient or a scenario, and they'd say, perform this examination on this patient. And then you could answer specific questions that you'd revised for. In reality, as a first year doctor, from day one, you're seeing real patients presenting with real problems, and you don't know what's going to come through next. Well, that was my experience in A&E. Anything can walk through the door, and you take the next patient on the list. And that's really where I started to learn. That's where you put it all together. You think on the spot. You're learning to do everything at once. So in medical school, it's like, right, I've got a patient here. Do this examination. What would you like to do next? And you'd say, okay, I'll do some blood tests. But in reality, as an F1 in A&E, I then do those blood tests. I then put the cannula in. I then wait for the results in 1 hour's time. I do the chest x-ray. You do it all together in one go whilst working with the team, the nurses and the consultants. So yeah, it's a massive learning curve. And I think it's one of those things you have to learn on the job. They call it a medical assistantship where I am, where you have these final year students joining us. They're getting really good exposure because they're being put in a position where they are seeing patients who are sick, and they're getting that experience before they actually start.
Can you remember when your first kind of COVID case was in Wolverhampton, your ward, or?
I actually can remember. So when it all started, the hype was around the news, and we were anticipating cases to come in at some point. Some consultants were more cautious than others. Some were less concerned. They thought, okay, we can manage this. Because at that point, we hadn't really been faced with COVID. We didn't know what strain we were going to come under. It was something that was really in the distance. It was in China, it was in Italy, and it was coming to us, and we couldn't predict when. The first I remember of this was when one of my senior colleagues who works on the respiratory ward that I've been on now, he saw one of the first patients who came through ITU, and he actually developed symptoms a couple of days after. This patient was swabbed, and that's actually the first I remember when I went to work. But then from that point onwards, we were having patients on the wards who were developing coughs, fevers, and we were treating them. And as time came on, we were swabbing them, and pretty quickly, actually, we had several patients in one go from the start who had tested as positive, and then from that point onwards, so many patients have got that virus.
When was it that COVID had reached the shores or entered Wolverhampton, or playing a more kind of dominant part of your thinking as a doctor?
From what I've read and heard, actually, and from what the hospital told us, Wolverhampton was faced quite early with coronavirus. It was one of the first places to really have a high number of cases, and this was traced back to various groups. Obviously, there's a lot to understand. There's a lot we don't know about why certain people do get coronavirus and why it spreads among certain groups more quickly. But we actually had this quite early on.
What have been the changes for you as a junior doctor since March?
Yeah, there's been so many changes, actually. If we maybe go back, if I take you back to January, actually, in January I was working on a respiratory ward, and normally we have high numbers of flu patients. So flu is another virus that does kill a lot of people with other illnesses and comorbidities. So in January, actually, December, January time, February, we see the most strain on a respiratory ward compared to the rest of the year. Now, in those sort of months, it's quite common for us to finish work late because we have six sick patients and a full ward. Now, heading into March, we were anticipating this coronavirus to be hitting our ward soon, and we were a little bit concerned because we were told that workload would go up. We were concerned for ITU, and we were concerned for our ward. We didn't know how we would manage. And there's various other medical devices and equipment, like we have something called a CPAP machine, NIV, these various different things.
What is a CPAP machine? Is that like a ventilator, or is that a...
So it's actually different to a ventilator.
Okay.
Ventilators are more for sort of ITU settings and critical care. A CPAP machine is a machine that helps keep the airways open. Probably the best way of describing it.
Right.
On our ward, we would give some patients this treatment to keep the airways open with a mask that they put on their face as a step prior to them needing to be ventilated. So it would help buy us some time to then put a patient on a ventilator later on if they were to require it, but also help them to recover. And
in terms of the kind of intensity from kind of, so you mentioned from January onwards, it just ramp up kind of overnight. We hear there's a Nightingale hospital that opened up in the Midlands as well.
Yeah, so I mean, it changed very quickly. Initially, so January, February time, we were a bit worried about March. And in March, pretty much straight away, as soon as the lockdown came into place, we were feeling more strained on the ward. So the consultant cover on the ward went up. Normally, we would have one consultant for each of the 2 respiratory wards.
Sure.
This went up to 2, sometimes even 3 per ward. This meant we were finishing the ward rounds where we see all the patients in the morning in a third of the time. The ward round can sometimes take half to 2/3 of the day, even a whole day sometimes. But when we had this number of consultants, it was taking us 2-3 hours. We were worried because we had patients coming in with coughs, with fevers, shortness of breath. Some were testing as positive, some were testing as negative, and we thought, okay, well, clinically they may have COVID. So there was a lot of anxieties around the ward, and we felt very, very strained on the ground. Now, at this point, we had full days. As sort of the days progressed, and probably a couple of weeks later, the rotas changed in my hospital. They redeployed doctors to places where they were needed. So they took people from other rotations, so from the community, from their GP practices, and put them on the wards, the medical wards. And they moved people like surgeons onto medical wards as well to make sure that we had enough cover. So on my ward, the cover went from probably on average of 3 or 4 juniors per day to 6 or 7 per day. And at night, normally we would have maybe 3 or 4 juniors across the medical wards. This changed to having sort of 2 or 3 per ward at night. We adapt there and then. It's changing every single day. I can actually take you back nearer the start. I remember when we had our first confirmed full day of COVID patients, and it was heartbreaking because they were deteriorating so quickly. We felt helpless. We were giving them everything we could to try and manage their illnesses, but this whole bay of patients were deteriorating so quickly. And I remember my colleague, who is only a year above me actually, has 1 more year of experience. She's an excellent doctor. And we are trained in things like breaking bad news. One of those things that you learn at medical school, but you get better with at practice. But in one day, she had to phone every relative or a relative of every patient in that bay and tell them that firstly, their family member is deteriorating and we can't say how things will be in a few hours' time or tomorrow. But secondly, to explain that if they were to visit them in hospital, their risk of catching this virus would be high, and that we actually have to discourage it at this point. This is when we were learning what we should be doing. And she found that incredibly difficult, and we felt strained for her. And then as days went on, my other colleague had to do the same, I had to do the same. And yeah, it's been very difficult. There's been a lot of anxieties around going into bays with infected patients, obviously anxieties around PPE, which I'm sure many people know about. And those anxieties essentially come around, firstly, the patients, are they going to deteriorate? We can't predict how things are going to be, and how is best to manage these patients? And secondly, how do we protect ourselves as healthcare workers?
Have you ever felt anxious in regards to your own individual protection?
I felt anxious very frequently, actually.
I'm sure you get calls from relatives as well who probably ask the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel anxious. I felt anxious from the very start because there was a lot of media hype around how dangerous this virus was and how infectious it was. We were told by our consultant that for every case of coronavirus, it infects 4, whereas for flu, it infects 2. And we know that flu is terrible itself, so surely this one's much more dangerous. We were very scared of it. I felt very, very anxious going into wards, I have to be honest, but my consultants are very, very, very supportive. We would be sensible about how many people would go into the ward. So we would have maybe one junior who would go in to see the patients with COVID on that particular day or week. We'd have consultants doing the ward round, standing in the middle whilst one person would examine the patients, and those kind of things. We were being very, very cautious to try and manage those anxieties and to keep ourselves safe. Equally, yeah, relatives are very anxious, but surprisingly, actually, I found a lot of relatives are very accepting of the situation. They're very accepting that their relative who's come into hospital is deteriorating, and at times I've been surprised how I mean, it's hard to say how they've been able to not see their patient, not see their relative on probably the last days of their life. You know, for me personally, I haven't been in that position, and I hopefully won't be. But there's nothing more I would like to do than obviously see my relative. But people are fearful at home. This is based on the fact that they're fearful of coming to see their relatives, not for any other reason.
And what are currently the rules in regards to going out to see relatives? Should they be currently in a ward for COVID? Is it still the same case as what you said earlier?
So you mean a relative at home coming to see their relative in hospital?
That's right.
It's very, very variable, actually. In the first few days and few weeks of this, it was something that was changing every single day. It would be based on, is that patient confirmed as COVID? Have they been swabbed as positive? Have they done their 7 days or 14 days? These things are changing all the time. Are there other patients in the bay who are at risk? Hospitals are managing this themselves, and it's often led by the infection prevention teams. And then that information is passed down to the ward managers, the ward sisters, and then we all follow that advice.
And one of the things that's also been talked about recently is the numbers of people who have, the numbers of people who are coming to A&E has declined year on year, from last year, in the sense that those people who have other ailments are feeling fearful and uncomfortable with the idea of coming into A&E. Is that a real concern that you have? And there must be almost in addition to that, a considerable backlog of operations, procedures, treatments, consultations.
Definitely, there's 2 parts to this. There's the acute illnesses, then you have the chronic illnesses. So the acute ones are the more sudden onset presentations, and the ones that mean a patient will deteriorate more quickly. So yeah, from the shifts I've been in A&E, where I'm clerking patients, I did one at night a couple of weeks ago, and I'd never seen it so quiet at night. There was very, very few patients. The ones who came in were often coughing or had a fever and were query COVID. In fact, they were treating everyone as query COVID until proven otherwise, which was quite good. But yeah, I experienced this myself. There were far fewer admissions than I was expecting, really. And on the other side of things, you've got the chronic illnesses. You have the patients who have long-standing conditions. So on my ward as a respiratory ward, you might have a patient who has a condition called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. It's a very, very common condition. And prior to this, we would see a number of admissions of patients who would come in with infective exacerbations of the COPD. So they might have a cough, productive cough, chest pain, chest tightness, or a fever or something. But we're seeing far fewer of these. And actually, I had a chat with my consultant the other day, and I said, what are we doing about these patients? Are they safe at home right now? And reassuringly, they are having face-to-face consultations with some of the consultants. But we know that once lockdown measures lift and people start socializing more, infection rates might go up, might become under more strain. But equally, as time progresses, there is going to be a bottleneck. There are going to be so many patients requiring that treatment in hospital, consultations.
Is it particular ethnic minorities that it's severely impacting, or is it just all BAME groups?
Well, I'm sure I can talk about this from my own personal experience, but also from sort of the evidence that's out there, which is still kind of accumulating. From a personal experience, I remember doing a shift on A&E 2 weeks ago, and one of the doctors there, who's more senior than I am, she came up to me and said she'd noticed that a lot of the patients she was seeing were like South Asian men. That was just one observation from her. Now, everyone's experience is going to be different. We have to take big population groups and then put that all together and see what the numbers tell us. That was her experience. And I can say from my work, I have seen patients who are South Asian or from these Black, Asian, minority or ethnic groups.
Are there a particular age group at all?
Particular age groups. The thing with COVID is that I've noticed it's affecting people across the board. We've had patients with 30 or 40 requiring intubation. We have something called a do not attempt resuscitation form for often elderly patients who have a poor chance of resuscitation or poor quality of life, or the outcome will be worse if we were to attempt resuscitation. And this virus is hitting people in their 30s and 40s, 50s, those who would be normally fit and well. And some of these are requiring these forms to be put in place because resuscitation would not help them. So yeah, it's affecting people across the board.
What type of shifts do you work on at the moment, or how long is your shift today? You're in between shifts right now. How long is your shift later this evening?
So normally my shifts are a normal day length, so it would be 9 till 5. Prior to COVID, it was 8:30 till 5 p.m. That would be a standard Monday to Friday. And then occasionally we would work weekends. We would do sort of evening cover shifts from like 5 p.m. till 10, in addition to the daytime 9 till 5. And then some doctors would do the night shift. As things changed, it changed from a sort of a 5-day on, 2-day off to 3 days working, 3 days off, 3 days working, 3 days off. So it allowed us to work for a shorter period of time and also have a longer period of rest in between, which is very, very helpful. Now, as we've been able to sort of manage the situation, they are redeploying certain people back to their original posts and starting to bring us back to the more sort of our usual rota. And now it's 4 days on, 2 days off, but there is much more cover on the wards.
And what do you do in your spare time? Like, should you get time after your shifts? You must be pretty shattered. How do you manage to kind of, get that rest and recover? I'm sure sleep is one of the first things you look to do, but what else do you end up doing in that time?
There's two things for me. One's music and one's exercise. So I enjoy going for walks. The weather's been fortunately quite nice around here, so I've been going for walks around fields around here, and also music. I actually DJ and make music.
So I was going to ask you about that. So that started from when you were in medical school, right? You were a musical producer. Is that right? You set up a record label. Do you want to tell us a little about that?
Yes, I've always been into music. As a child, I played saxophone, piano, clarinet. I was in jazz bands. And when I got to university, I was fascinated by sort of the clubbing scene, not actually by the clubbing itself, but by the DJing and the music. I thought, how can I apply what I've done to something different now? And yeah, I bought a pair of sort of basic decks. I learned how to do a basic mixing. But in parallel to that, I was also making my own music. I'd always been making my own music on my laptop. I bought a keyboard, started producing my own tracks. And in my second year of med school, I saw these two final year business students launch something. It was supposed to be this world's first student-led record label. And they're reaching out to those who are interested in music to get behind this and become part of the team. So I got involved. I was initially head of marketing. We got some sort of BBC plays. And the aim was to give those who are working within the team, all student volunteers, a career springboard to develop work experience within the music industry, which is something quite mysterious. How do you get a job in the music industry? Build connections, but also give artists that platform to show their music off.
So are you producing much music at the moment? Do you manage to get time to do that? And what kind of music do you produce?
So I produce mostly dance music, but also pop, urban. I'm into music across the board. I'm one of these people who I don't want to pigeonhole myself because I just love it all. I'm there to enjoy it. I don't want to say I'm just going to do this one thing. Right now, I'm actually working on a couple of tracks, a couple of original pieces, remixes, But I'm actually dedicating all of my time at the moment to something I've developed called NH Sessions, where I'm posting videos of creatives, DJs, live performers on Instagram. And it's been crazy. We've had an incredible response. We've had the backing of tastemakers across the world, Radio 1, influencers. It's been amazing.
Well, I was going to ask about that. So in terms of music on the radio, like hospital radio, does that still exist? You hear about the number of stories of radio presenters who once upon a time first started out on kind of hospital radio. What's going on there?
It doesn't exist. And actually, I got involved in hospital radio before I started university. When I was doing my work experience, this is when I was doing my work experience to become a doctor.
Sure.
I saw this in the hospital advertised, and I got involved at my local hospital. So it does exist, and patients do tune in. I know they do. So it's a worthwhile cause.
Okay. And do you ever get to hear? Do your patients at the moment listen to it? Should they be able to?
They should be able to. The hospital radio exists. Unfortunately, a lot of our patients are quite sick at the moment, so their focus is just to recover at the moment.
Do you think we value the NHS and the roles of those people who work in the NHS enough prior to COVID and during COVID?
Prior to COVID, it's a very difficult thing for me to comment on, because I haven't got much experience working in the NHS, but I've always felt personally privileged to have access to something like the NHS. But perhaps my opinion is slightly biased because I always wanted to become a doctor.
Sure.
It definitely is biased. But since COVID has began, definitely there's been a complete change and a complete focus on the good things about the medical profession, the healthcare workers, but also other people who are face to face with coronavirus. You've got porters, you've got healthcare assistants, you've got domestic staff who are also frontline.
Well, that's a very good point. So we often talk about doctors and nurses, we don't necessarily talk about porters, healthcare assistants. But if there's one person that, if you were to give the shout out, you don't have to give the person's name, who performs a role that we don't necessarily think of within the NHS, who would that be?
I would definitely say the porters. I think across the board, this will be in every single hospital. When you think of health, you don't necessarily think of porters. But when you have a sick patient who needs a chest X-ray, or they have to be moved from the ward to ITU, we need a porter who's trained in getting them there as quickly and as safely as possible. Now, their risk is immense because they're having to come into contact with hundreds of patients every single day. I remember speaking to a porter before COVID came into play, and he told me sort of half a day in, he'd already walked 10 kilometers. Now,
wow, 10 kilometers in half a day.
Yeah, and he told me that it's constant. They drop a patient off, they come and collect another one, and they're coming face to face with these patients constantly.
Well, I think that's a noble group of people that we've never really thought out and talked about. It's a shout out to the porters up and down the country, and hopefully we're seeing talk of maybe a lockdown being unlifted at some point. But let's say when it does get lifted, what's the first thing that you'd look to do?
The first thing, I want to see my friends. I want to have some time with my family. That's probably the first thing. One thing I miss most is doing the things I enjoyed in my free time, going for a meal, going to the cinema, just chilling with people at home. Right now I'm on my own because actually I was self-isolating, so I've set up on my own because I swabbed as positive.
So you you have had COVID, or you currently do have COVID?
So I have had it. If I still have it, I'm not actually sure, but I'm playing it as safe as possible.
Sure.
3 weeks ago, I developed a cough after a night shift, and I was a little bit concerned. So I had a sleep, woke up, and the cough had got a little worse. So I phoned up the occupational health department at the hospital. They told me to self-isolate for 7 days, but to also get swabbed. So I got swabbed within 48 hours, and within a day after that, it came back as positive.
Well, that's a pretty quick response time as well in terms of the situation.
I mean, that was very, very quick for me. I know it's variable for sort of my other colleagues and for other hospitals, but yeah, for me, it was very, very quick. Yeah. And
I'm just going to ask one last thing. So I may have mentioned that future mother-in-law sent me a mask in the post. There it is. Actually, more looks like a kind of a surgical mask in some respects. But so just checking in regards to how one should wear it. Like, you know, if I put it over my ears, it's not going to go over my ears. But it needs to cover my nose and my mouth. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it actually looks very much like a surgical mask.
It's the right colour, isn't it?
With a mask, the important thing is it should cover your nose, it should cover your mouth, and once you put it on, you shouldn't touch it.
Shouldn't touch it at all. You shouldn't touch your face at all.
Don't touch your face. You leave it on and you take it off. And then, if it's disposable, you dispose of it for the next one on.
Okay.
That's really crucial because a lot of people out there touching their face, even to have a drink and things, that's ineffective. Firstly, it'll break that seal around your nose and mouth. Secondly, you're giving the virus a chance to get closer to your mouth and nose.
Well, I might...
Looks good, actually.
Well, it is very good. I might stretch it out a little bit because my nose is a little bit too big. But Kishan, look, it's been a delight. Thank you ever so much for coming on, and thank you for everything that you're doing. And hopefully meet you soon and get to hear some of your music. So do send that across. Brilliant. Take care.
See you later.
Thank you soon. Bye, Kishan.